Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a breath for a moment, because today we're talking about something that doesn't just challenge your mind, it challenges your identity. Why does leaving a narcissist feel impossible? Why can someone who hurts you also feel like the person you can't walk away from? I want you to know before we go any further, you're not weak, you're not foolish, and you're not broken, you're human. And what you've been facing is designed intentionally or not to confuse you, consume you, and convince you that you can't survive without them. But here's the truth, you can. And today, I'm going to explain exactly why it feels impossible, and the mindset shift that turns impossible into done. Let's break this down together. Narcissists create emotional addiction, not love. It begins subtly, in ways that feel warm, intoxicating, and almost spiritual. When you first meet a narcissist, they often mirror your best qualities, reflect your deepest needs, and make you feel seen in a way you may not have felt in years. They listen closely, they study you, they memorize your hopes and fears, and then they feed those back to you, as if you finally found someone who understands your soul. This stage is powerful because it forges a lightning-fast bond. It feels like connection, but it's actually chemistry, dopamine, adrenaline, and validation all firing at once. That's not love. That's attachment created by intensity, not intimacy. A narcissist doesn't build love through consistency or honesty. They manufacture emotional highs that trigger a cycle. Think of it like a slot machine. You pull the lever, and sometimes you get affection, attention, or praise. And sometimes you get silence, criticism, or manipulation. The unpredictability is what creates the addiction. When rewards are inconsistent, the brain becomes obsessed with trying to get the next hit, the next moment of validation, the next piece of approval. You start chasing the version of them who make you feel special, even though that version appears less and less. The very person who causes the pain becomes the same person you feel desperate to soothe you. This is the emotional trap, and it's one of the hardest bonds to break. What makes this so confusing is that the narcissist seems so genuine in the beginning. They invest heavily up front, getting you a concentrated dose of attention and admiration. They may text constantly, make big promises, speak about the future, or express feelings that seem too deep for how little time you've known each other. For someone who's been overlooked or undervalued, that attention feels like coming up for air after being underwater. But once they sense you're emotionally invested, they begin to shift. The warmth cools. The certainty becomes unstable. You begin to question what you did wrong. And every time you try to figure it out, they offer just enough reassurance to pull you back. You mistake the emotional roller coaster for passion, when really, it's a cycle of control. This cycle conditions you. At first, you respond to the good moments with joy. Then you respond to them with relief. Then you respond to them with desperation. That shift alone is proof that what's happening is not love. Real love doesn't make you anxious about losing it. Real love doesn't feel like a test you're constantly failing. Real love doesn't make you feel smaller as time goes on. Emotional addiction, however, does exactly that. It narrows your world. It makes you prioritize their needs over your own. It makes you believe that the connection is unique, rare, even irreplaceable. But the truth is, what you're feeling is not deep love. It's deep dependency created by manipulation. A narcissist draws you in with intensity and then trains you to crave their approval. Every compliment becomes a reward. Every insult becomes something you try desperately to fix. Every withdrawal of affection becomes a challenge. Your nervous system gets rewired to respond to their behavior as if it determines your worth. When they give you affection again, even briefly, the relief is overwhelming. And that relief releases dopamine, the same chemical involved in addiction. Over time, your body learns that emotional peace only comes from the same person who causes the emotional chaos. That is not a relationship. That is conditioning. Another layer of the addiction comes from the way narcissists blur emotional boundaries. They may tell you things like, "No one will ever love you like I do," or "We're meant for each other," or "You and I have something other people don't understand." Statements like these create a psychological cage, convincing you that stepping away would mean losing something extraordinary. They make you doubt that anyone else could offer the same intensity. But intensity is not love. Intensity is stimulation. And stimulation is the foundation of emotional addiction, not emotional safety. The narcissist also creates scarcity. When someone makes you feel deeply valued one moment and invisible the next, you begin to fear that any small mistake will push them away. You start walking on emotional eggshells. You analyze your tone, your text, your reaction. Instead of asking whether you're being treated well, you ask whether you're doing enough to keep them from withdrawing. You don't realize that you've begun to adjust your identity around their moods. The more you try to hold on to their good side, the more they control the entire dynamic. And the more control they have, the deeper the addiction grows. One of the most powerful tools a narcissist uses to create emotional dependency is intermittent validation. They give you moments of softness, apology, or vulnerability right when you're about to leave, or set boundaries. This is not accidental. It's a reset button. It convinces you that the person you fell for is still there. You begin believing that if you just love them better, support them more, stay a little longer, prove your loyalty, that version will return permanently. But the good version only appears to maintain the cycle. It's bait, not bonding. Over time, your self-worth becomes entangled with their approval. You measure your value by how they respond to you. You stay hoping for emotional fulfillment from someone who emotionally starves you. You start believing the highs mean something profound instead of seeing they are simply the reward in a system designed to keep you attached. Emotional addiction blinds you to patterns. It makes you justify behavior you never would have tolerated before. It makes you believe your pain is proof of devotion. It makes you confuse endurance with strength. But none of that is love. What makes emotional addiction even stronger is the belief that you can fix the narcissist. They give you just enough glimpses of vulnerability to spark your compassion, your empathy, or your desire to help. They may share a sad story from their past, admit to old wounds, or suggest they've been misunderstood. This creates a rescue fantasy, pulling you deeper, because you believe you're the one person who truly sees them. But these glimpses are selective. They are shown to gain loyalty, not connection. And your belief that they need you becomes another chain in the emotional trap. Through all of this, you begin losing sight of your own emotional reality. You learn to suppress your needs to keep the peace. You let go of boundaries because enforcing them leads to conflict. You shrink pieces of yourself to avoid confrontation. You start living in response to their behavior instead of your own values. By the time you realize how exhausted you are, the addiction feels like attachment, and the fear of leaving feels like losing a part of yourself. But what you're losing is not love. It's the illusion that you needed their approval to be whole. Confusion is their control strategy. It doesn't start with chaos. It starts with clarity. In the beginning, the narcissist seems straightforward, confident, and predictable. They present themselves as someone who knows exactly what they want, someone who appears emotionally stable, someone who talks with certainty. That sense of certainty pulls you in because it feels safe. As soon as they sense that you trust them, as soon as you begin to bond, the clarity begins to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly, quietly, in ways that make you doubt your own perception rather than question theirs. Confusion becomes the fog that keeps you from seeing what's really happening, and that fog is deliberate. A confused person is easier to control than a confident one. The strategy begins with subtle inconsistencies. They say things that don't match their actions. They compliment you one day and criticize you the next. They rewrite conversations to make themselves the victim or the hero. They deny statements you clearly remember hearing. At first, you tell yourself they're tired, stressed, or misunderstood. You give them the benefit of the doubt because you care. But over time, these inconsistencies accumulate, and your mind starts trying to reconcile two conflicting realities: the person who seemed emotionally stable and the person who now creates emotional chaos. That mental conflict is the narcissist's advantage. When you're busy trying to understand them, you stop noticing how much you're losing yourself. One of the most powerful tools they use is gaslighting. Instead of addressing the actual issue, they twist your words, question your memory, or accuse you of being too sensitive or dramatic. They shift the focus away from their behavior and onto your reaction. If you're hurt, they say you're overreacting. If you're confused, they say you're imagining things. If you point out something inconsistent, they accuse you of misunderstanding. This constant invalidation creates self-doubt. You begin questioning your judgment. You hesitate before bringing up concerns. You replay conversations in your head to figure out what you missed. And the more unsure you become, the more dependent you feel on their version of events. Narcissists know that when you don't trust your own mind, you'll rely on theirs. They want you to feel off balance, not because they need to be right, but because they need to stay in control. A balanced relationship is built on transparency and honesty. But a narcissistic relationship thrives on confusion and instability. When you can't predict their mood, you spend your emotional energy trying to anticipate their reactions. That unpredictability keeps you emotionally invested, always trying to avoid conflict or earn approval. It turns your attention away from your needs and toward managing their behavior. Another layer of confusion comes from how they switch between charm and cruelty. They can be incredibly warm in one moment, attentive, affectionate, even apologetic, and then cold and dismissive the next. This emotional whiplash is not random. It conditions you to tolerate negative behavior because you're constantly waiting for the good version of them to reappear. You start believing the good moments are the real them, and the bad moments are temporary. But in reality, the bad moments reveal their true patterns, and the good moments are strategically placed to reset the cycle. That constant emotional pendulum keeps you hooked, not because the relationship is strong, but because the inconsistency keeps you chasing stability. They also create confusion by shifting blame. When there's a disagreement, they redirect attention away from their actions and onto your flaws. If they lie, it's because you made them feel pressured. If they withdraw, it's because you're too demanding. If they get angry, it's because you triggered them. Over time, you begin to carry responsibility for both your own emotions and theirs. You apologize more, even when you're not wrong. You try to be perfect to avoid conflict. You question whether your needs are unreasonable. And the more responsibility you take, the more control they gain. Confusion also shows up in the way they distort reality through storytelling. They rewrite history to suit their narrative. They minimize past harm and exaggerate your mistakes. They frame themselves as misunderstood or unfairly judged, making you feel guilty for questioning them. They paint themselves as loyal, loving, or self-sacrificing, even when their actions say otherwise. The narrative they build is designed to make you doubt your own perception of their behavior. When someone tells you often enough that your memory is wrong, your emotions are misguided, or your reactions are irrational, you start believing it. Another tactic they use is keeping you in emotional limbo. They avoid giving clear answers when you ask important questions. They won't define the relationship, commit to change, or acknowledge harm. They keep things open-ended enough to give you hope, but vague enough that you never feel secure. This emotional limbo creates anxiety, and the anxiety creates dependency. You cling to any sign of affection, relief, or clarity because the uncertainty is so exhausting. The need for reassurance becomes a constant state, and the narcissist becomes the only person who can temporarily quiet that internal chaos. Confusion also thrives in the silence they create. Narcissists use withdrawal, emotional or physical, as a way to punish and control. When they don't get what they want, they disappear, ignore you, or shut down. The silence becomes another form of manipulation. Instead of focusing on how disrespectful the behavior is, you focus on how to make it stop. You second-guess your actions, trying to figure out what triggered the withdrawal. You send long messages apologizing, explaining, or trying to fix the situation even when you did nothing wrong. That silence forces you to chase them for clarity, reinforcing the imbalance of power. Eventually, the confusion becomes the environment you live in. You stop trusting your instincts, you suppress your feelings, you minimize your needs, you try to maintain peace by staying quiet, accommodating their moods, or avoiding confrontation altogether. You begin to lose confidence in your own judgment. And that loss of confidence is exactly what keeps the narcissist in control. They don't need to control your choices directly. They only need to control how you perceive yourself. When you doubt your own reality, you become easier to manipulate, easier to quiet, and easier to keep. This confusion doesn't mean you're weak. It means you were targeted in ways designed to disorient you. It means you were dealing with someone who understands that clarity empowers people, and empowered people are harder to control. The confusion was never a side effect. It was the strategy. You bond to the apology, not the behavior. That single dynamic is one of the most powerful psychological hooks in a relationship with a narcissist. It's not the hurt itself that keeps you attached. It's the moments right after the apology, the promises, the soft words that appear just when you're at your breaking point. Those moments create an emotional reset that feels like healing, but is actually another layer of manipulation. The apology becomes the reward, the relief after the storm, the thing you cling to, because it feels like the closest thing to love you've experienced with them. And that's exactly why it's so hard to walk away. In healthy relationships, apologies are connected to accountability and change. When someone genuinely apologizes, their behavior shifts, they adjust, they grow. The apology means something because it's backed by action. With a narcissist, the apology is disconnected from the change. It's a tool, not a transformation. They apologize when they sense they're losing control, when they feel you pulling away, or when they want to reset the dynamic before you start asking too many questions. The apology isn't about your healing. It's about maintaining their access to you. That disconnect is what creates the cycle you become emotionally tied to. The first time they hurt you and then apologize, it feels meaningful. They may look sincere, speak softly, even show vulnerability. They might say things like, "I didn't mean to, I'll do better," or "Please don't leave me." You want to believe them because you care, because you've seen the side of them. That felt loving because you don't want to think they hurt you intentionally. That emotional hope combined with their sudden shift into remorse creates a surge of relief. You feel understood again. You feel reconnected. You feel like the relationship is salvageable. That relief becomes addictive because it gives you a momentary sense of safety after feeling emotionally threatened. Over time, your nervous system becomes conditioned to attach to that relief. The cycle becomes predictable. Tension builds. Something hurtful happens. You confront it or collapse emotionally, and then comes the apology. The apology becomes the high point of the cycle. The emotional reward. Your heart learns to crave the reconciliation because it temporarily soothes the anxiety the relationship itself created. You don't bond to the mistreatment, but you bond deeply to the moment it stops. That's the trap. You start interpreting the apology as proof of love instead of recognizing it as part of the cycle that keeps you stuck. A narcissist often enhances this bond by sprinkling in moments of vulnerability during the apology. They might share a painful memory, blame their behavior on something from their past, or express fear of losing you. This vulnerability feels intimate and real. It makes you feel chosen, needed, or special. You start believing that your love can help them heal, or that you can be the person who inspires their change. This belief pulls you deeper because it feels noble, compassionate, even loyal, but those moments of vulnerability are carefully timed. They appear when the narcissist senses they need to soften you, not because they're actually confronting their behavior. The apology also becomes powerful because it hooks into your emotional values. If you're someone who believes in forgiveness, patience, empathy, or working through conflict, the narcissist uses that against you. They rely on the fact that you are a caring person who doesn't want to give up easily. They lean on your desire for connection, for stability, for love. Their apologies are shaped in ways that appeal directly to your emotional core. They say just enough to reignite hope, but never enough to create accountability. They rely on your heart to override your logic. Another reason the apology becomes a bond is because the relationship often begins with intensity. You remember how good things felt in the beginning, how deeply connected you believed you were, how seen and appreciated you felt. When the narcissist apologizes, it can feel like the beginning is coming back. You think, this is the real them. You believe that the good moments represent who they truly are, and that the bad moments are the exception. But in truth, the good moments are the exception, the intentional ones. The apology brings back just enough of the illusion to make you stay, to make you hope that the relationship can return to what it once was. Gradually, the apology becomes the only moment where you feel valued. The rest of the relationship becomes unpredictable, unstable, or emotionally draining. You start craving the apology because it's the one moment where they show affection, validation, or reassurance. Even if the apology is minimal or vague, your brain magnifies it because it stands out against the backdrop of tension. The contrast makes the apology feel more meaningful than it actually is. This contrast is a psychological trick, not a reflection of genuine change. Narcissists also use apologies strategically by making them conditional. They may apologize, but follow it with excuses, implying that you contributed to their behavior. Statements like, "I'm sorry, but you made me angry," or "I wouldn't have done that if you didn't act that way," subtly shift responsibility onto you. Over time, you start feeling guilty for their actions. The apology becomes a moment where you not only forgive them, but also question yourself. This deepens the bond even further because you begin to believe that you play a role in their behavior, and that if you can change yourself, the relationship will improve. You also bond to the apology because leaving becomes emotionally layered. You don't want to leave someone who shows remorse. You don't want to abandon someone who says they're trying. You don't want to give up on a relationship that occasionally feels deeply meaningful. The apology keeps you in a state of internal conflict. One part of you knows something is wrong, but another part clings to the words that sound like love. The apology becomes the rope you hold on to, while ignoring the weight that's pulling you down. This bond becomes even stronger when the apology is paired with temporary behavior changes. After apologizing, the narcissist may act kinder, more attentive, or more present for a little while. This honeymoon phase creates more evidence for your emotional mind to hold on to. You begin telling yourself the relationship is improving. But as soon as they feel secure again, the old patterns return. And each cycle strengthens the emotional attachment because the temporary changes feed your hope. Another layer to this bond is your own emotional investment. You've put time, energy, love, and effort into the relationship. You don't want those investments to feel wasted. The apology keeps the possibility of payoff alive. It keeps you believing that your patience might finally lead to the change you've been waiting for. Letting go feels like giving up not just on the person, but on the emotional labor you've poured into them. So you stay, waiting for the apology to turn into behavior, even though it rarely does. In the end, it's the apology, not the relationship itself, that becomes the glue. The apology becomes the emotional reset, the reassurance, the hope, the momentary relief that makes the pain feel tolerable. You don't bond to the hurt, you bond to the healing you think is happening. But the healing never actually comes because the apology is only meant to keep the cycle alive. They break you down, so you question your reality. It doesn't happen loudly, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, in the soft, subtle ways that slip under your awareness until you don't recognize yourself anymore. A narcissist doesn't need to control you with force. They control you by eroding the parts of you that once felt solid: your memories, your intuition, your judgment, your emotional compass. When those parts weaken, they step in and offer you their version of reality as a replacement. And because you're already emotionally invested, you accept it before you even realize what's happening. It begins with small comments disguised as observation. They point out how you misremember things, how you're too sensitive, how you take things the wrong way. They say it with a tone that almost sounds caring, as if they're trying to help you see something you're supposedly missing. You start to second-guess your reactions because the criticism isn't explosive, it's subtle and repeated. Over time, you internalize those observations. Instead of trusting your first instinct, you pause and think, maybe I am overreacting. That pause is the moment they start gaining control. Once they realize you're starting to doubt yourself, the tactics escalate. They rewrite conversations. They deny promises. They act confused by things you remember clearly. When you try to confront them with facts, they respond with shock, pity, or disbelief. Sometimes they turn it around and say, why would I ever say something like that? Or you're imagining things again. And because you've already been conditioned to question your own perception, you believe them more than you believe yourself. Bit by bit, your trust in your own memory fades. The erasure of your reality becomes even more effective when they mix denial with occasional acknowledgement. Maybe one time out of 10, they admit they said something hurtful. The inconsistency makes you think you're getting closer to the truth, when in reality, they're only giving you enough validation to keep you unsure. This inconsistency makes you cling to their rare moments of honesty while ignoring the pattern. It keeps you attached to the illusion that if you just communicate better, they'll understand. But they do understand, they just benefit from your confusion. Another part of breaking you down is emotional manipulation disguised as concern. They subtly criticize your personality traits, the ones that used to feel like strengths. They might say you're too emotional, too dramatic, too forgetful, too trusting, too closed off, or too reactive. They point to your supposed flaws during moments of vulnerability, making you believe these are the reasons the relationship feels unstable. You begin working harder to be the version of yourself they want, not realizing that the goalpost keeps moving. No matter how much you change, they always find something else to break down. They also isolate your emotional experiences. When you feel hurt, they invalidate it. When you feel confused, they belittle it. When you feel scared, they tell you you're imagining things. This emotional invalidation teaches you to hide your feelings, not just from them, but from yourself. You start minimizing your pain, excusing their behavior, and suppressing your instincts. Eventually, you lose touch with your internal signals, the very signals that should protect you from harm. One of the strongest ways they distort reality is by reframing their harmful behavior as normal or justified. If they raise their voice, they say you pushed them to it. If they lie, they say you misunderstood. If they betray you, they claim you weren't supportive enough. If they withdraw, they insist you smothered them. Every action they take becomes your fault. You become responsible not only for your own emotions, but for theirs as well. This emotional burden makes you believe that if you change, the relationship will get better. But the relationship isn't broken because of you. It's broken because they benefit from the imbalance. Breaking you down also involves rewriting your past. They take moments where you were strong and reinterpret them as selfishness. They take moments when you were hurt and claim you were being dramatic. They twist your intentions until you doubt your own goodness. And when they retell events with such confidence, such conviction, you start believing their version, even when it contradicts your memories. You begin living in a narrative you didn't choose. The more they distort your sense of self, the harder it becomes to stand up for yourself. You stop trusting your voice. You stop believing your feelings are valid. You stop asserting your needs because every time you try, it gets turned into another reason you're supposedly the problem. You feel like the relationship is slipping through your fingers, but instead of walking away, you try harder. You try to be calmer, quieter, more understanding, more patient. You believe that if you can just find the right way to express yourself, things will stabilize, but the instability is part of the control. Another piece of this strategy is how they alternate between breaking you down and building you up. After causing emotional chaos, they might suddenly praise you, tell you how important you are, or act incredibly kind. These moments feel like clarity, like sunlight after a storm. You cling to them because they make you feel anchored again. But that's the trick. The contrast between chaos and calm makes the stability feel deeper than it is. You start believing their approval is proof you're not losing your mind. So every time they tear you down, you stay long enough to wait for the rebuild. That cycle binds you emotionally to the very person dismantling your confidence. As the erosion continues, you start living in a state of internal conflict. You know something is wrong, but you can't identify it clearly. You know you're in pain, but you can't explain why. You know you're losing yourself, but you can't pinpoint when it started. You feel confused, and the narcissist uses that confusion as evidence that you're the unstable one. They turn your self-doubt into their justification. Every time you question your reality, it strengthens the illusion of theirs. Eventually, the emotional breakdown becomes so complete that you begin accepting their criticisms as truth. You believe you're not enough. You believe you're flawed. You believe you're the reason things fall apart. And when someone convinces you that you're broken, they no longer need to control you directly. You begin controlling yourself in ways that benefit them. You become cautious, overly apologetic, hyper-aware, and emotionally dependent. That dependency is the result of having your reality dismantled piece by piece. You don't realize the extent of the breakdown until you try to imagine leaving. You feel paralyzed by uncertainty. You doubt your ability to make decisions. You fear you won't survive without their guidance. The thought of walking away feels like stepping into a world where nothing makes sense anymore. That fear isn't because you're weak. It's because your reality has been shaped by someone who built their power on your self-doubt. They don't just change how you see the relationship, they change how you see yourself. They don't just challenge your perception, they replace it. They don't just distort your experiences, they redefine them. They break you down until questioning you. Reality feels normal, and trusting your intuition feels dangerous. Your self-worth erodes slowly, not suddenly. That's the part most people misunderstand. They assume toxic relationships destroy you in one dramatic moment. But that's not how a narcissist works. They're far more calculated, far more patient, far more subtle. They don't hammer at your self-esteem. They chip at it gently, consistently, in ways that feel almost harmless at first. They break you down in whispers, not shouts. And because the erosion is gradual, you don't notice it happening until the person staring back at you in the mirror feels like a faded version of who you used to be. It starts with tiny critiques that seem insignificant. Little comments about how you think, how you speak, how you handle situations. They might say you're too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic, or too quiet. On the surface, these remarks appear casual, even playful, but they carry a weight that slowly presses against your confidence. You brush them off in the beginning because every relationship involves feedback. You tell yourself they're just being honest. But honesty that cuts instead of helps is not honesty, it's conditioning. And conditioning becomes the soil where self-doubt grows. Once they learn which insecurities prick you the most, they return to those spots again and again. Sometimes the comments are direct, sometimes disguised as jokes, sometimes framed as advice, but the aim is always the same: to blur your confidence and sharpen your dependence. You begin adjusting your behavior to avoid criticism. You start toning down your personality, editing your opinions, shrinking your voice. This is the first layer of erosion, changing yourself in small ways to keep the peace. Then comes the comparison stage. They compare you to other people's exes, friends, strangers, siblings, coworkers. They point out how someone else handles stress better, dresses better, communicates better, or understands them more fully. At first, you feel embarrassed or insecure, but eventually, those comparisons start shaping your sense of identity. You start believing you're not enough, not attractive enough, not smart enough, not patient enough, not supportive enough. And once you start doubting your worth, you begin relying on their words to define it. The erosion deepens through inconsistency. One day they compliment you, the next they criticize you for the same thing. One day they say they're proud of you, the next they belittle your achievements. This inconsistency keeps your emotions unstable. When they build you up, you feel relieved. When they tear you down, you feel desperate. The instability creates a psychological dependency where their positive attention becomes the only thing that temporarily restores your sense of worth. You begin associating your value with their approval. As your self-esteem weakens, your tolerance for mistreatment grows. You start accepting behavior you never would have tolerated before. You convince yourself that if you try harder, they'll treat you better. You rationalize the disrespect because your belief in your own value is now tied to how they treat you. And since they've been slowly changing the way you see yourself, you no longer recognize the difference between what you deserve and what you're getting. Another part of the erosion happens through emotional minimization. Every time you express hurt, they downplay it. They tell you you're overreacting or being too sensitive. They dismiss your feelings as irrational or exaggerated. Eventually, you stop trusting your emotional responses. You stop advocating for yourself. You stop expressing your needs. Your self-worth becomes quiet because you've been taught that your emotions are too much. You begin believing that your feelings are the problem, not their behavior. At this point, you begin internalizing their criticisms. Their voice becomes your inner voice. You replay their words in your mind long after the argument is over. You start second-guessing your decisions, your appearance, your goals, your personality. You shrink parts of yourself to fit the mold of who they want you to be. You dim your light so it doesn't trigger their insecurity. You silence your strengths so they don't feel overshadowed. Little by little, you lose pieces of yourself. The erosion of self-worth also shows up in the physical signs of exhaustion. You feel emotionally drained, mentally foggy, constantly anxious. You apologize more than you should. You feel guilty for things that aren't your fault. You question whether you're lovable. You stop celebrating your achievements. You begin believing you should be grateful for any affection you receive, even if it's inconsistent or crumbs compared to what you give. These are symptoms of a worn-down sense of self. Narcissists reinforce this erosion by making you feel replaceable. They may flirt with others, talk about their options, compare your relationship to someone else's, or remind you how lucky you are to have them. The message is clear. You're not special, but they are. You begin fearing abandonment because your self-worth has become tied to their presence. They've trained you to believe that losing them means losing the last source of validation you trust. One of the deepest forms of erosion is when you stop recognizing your strengths. The qualities you once took pride in, your kindness, your resilience, your empathy, your intelligence, become weaknesses in their narrative. If you're kind, they say you're naive. If you set boundaries, they say you're rude. If you have goals, they say you're selfish. If you express emotions, they say you're dramatic. Slowly, they rewrite your strengths into flaws until you no longer trust your own goodness. You also begin isolating yourself. You pull back from friends and family, partly because the narcissist encourages it, and partly because you're ashamed of how diminished you feel. The more isolated you become, the more you rely on the narcissist for emotional direction. And when they are the only voice speaking into your worth, their voice becomes truth. Their judgments become your beliefs. Their disappointment becomes your fear. Their validation becomes your oxygen. The erosion reaches its deepest point when you start believing you're unlovable without them. You think no one else would want you. You believe no one else would tolerate your flaws. You convince yourself that the relationship is the best you can get. This is not love, it's psychological starvation. The narcissist has spent so long draining your self-worth that you've forgotten it ever existed in the first place. Eventually, you begin living in survival mode. You don't strive to be happy, you strive to avoid conflict. You don't express your truth, you adapt to theirs. You don't feel deserving of peace, you feel grateful for temporary relief. Your world becomes smaller than ever because your self-worth has shrunk to the size of their approval. And even though the erosion is devastating, you rarely notice it happening in real time because it's gradual. It's disguised as love, disguised as guidance, disguised as protection. But it's erosion, all the same, slow and steady, wearing you down until you're living a life you barely recognize, shaped by a belief you never chose, that your worth is conditional, fragile, and determined by someone who benefits from you doubting it. Hope becomes the trap that keeps you stuck, because when you're dealing with a narcissist, the most powerful force in the entire relationship isn't the love, the memories, or even the fear. It's the hope. The hope that maybe this time they'll understand you. Maybe this time they'll follow through on the apology. Maybe this time they'll keep their promises. Or treat you the way they treated you in the beginning. You hold on to that hope like it's a lifeline. Because in those rare moments, when they give you kindness, affection, or attention, it feels like proof that the relationship can be saved. That maybe all the pain will finally have a purpose. That maybe they're capable of being the person you once believed they were, but this hope isn't real hope. It's conditional hope. It's a hope you're forced to earn through emotional labor, self-sacrifice, and endless patience. It's a hope that keeps you in a cycle where you're always waiting for something that never stays long enough to build a life on. This hope becomes a trap because it dangles possibility in front of you without ever giving you true consistency. And your mind becomes trained to chase those brief moments of warmth like a reward. You start believing that if you can just do things differently, communicate better, stay calmer, avoid triggers, or make them feel more secure, you will finally get the version of them they occasionally showed you in. The beginning, the trap works because narcissists are experts at timing. They know when you're about to pull away. They know when you're emotionally exhausted. They know when you're questioning your decision to stay. And right at that moment, almost like flipping a switch, they soften. They show remorse. They say the right things. They show just enough effort to make you think change is possible. This is not accidental. It's reinforcement. It's the same psychological loop used in addictive cycles, where unpredictable rewards keep you emotionally tethered. Your brain releases dopamine when they suddenly become good again, and you mistake this chemical spike for genuine love or progress over time. Hope becomes painful, not empowering. It becomes something you cling to out of desperation rather than belief. You begin to silence your own needs because speaking up risks losing those brief moments of peace. You convince yourself that the good times mean something deeper, even though they are strategically given. You start explaining away the bad behavior because the tiny glimpses of tenderness feel too meaningful to let go of. It doesn't matter that the ratio of pain to peace is wildly imbalanced. What matters is that the hope feels like the only part of the relationship that hasn't betrayed. Your hope becomes the trap because you're not just hoping for them to change. You're hoping for the story of your relationship to make sense. You're hoping that all the effort you've poured in won't end up wasted. You're hoping that the version of them you saw at the beginning wasn't an illusion. You're hoping that the bond you felt was real and that it meant something to them too. And when you've emotionally invested so deeply, walking away feels like admitting that none of it was what you thought. That the relationship you were fighting for only existed in your mind, not in reality. One of the most painful parts of this trap is the belief that you're almost there, that the finish line is close, that if you just hold on a little longer, they'll finally understand how much you care. Narcissists feed this illusion by giving vague, incremental signs of improvement. They make promises they never plan to keep. They talk about the future in moments where they fear losing control. They make you feel seen only long enough to keep you from leaving. And every time they do, your brain interprets it as progress. Instead of manipulation, the hope becomes even stronger because narcissists create a dynamic where leaving feels like failure. They subtly convince you that you didn't try hard enough, weren't understanding enough, weren't supportive enough, weren't patient enough. So instead of recognizing their patterns, you blame yourself. You believe that if you can fix yourself, you can fix the relationship. That if you change enough, they will too. And this self-blame fuels the hope because it gives you a false sense of control in a situation where you actually don't have any. The trap also deepens because the narcissist often plays both roles, the source of your pain and the person you hope will heal it. They hurt you, then they comfort you. They break your trust, then they ask for forgiveness. They shatter your confidence, then they offer validation. This creates a bond where your relief comes from the same person who caused your suffering, and that emotional whiplash convinces your brain that they're the only one who can restore balance. This is why hope becomes the glue that keeps you attached. You're not just hoping they change. You're hoping they fix the pain they created. And then there's the fear of starting over, the fear of losing everything you invested, the fear of regret, the fear that maybe, just maybe, you could be wrong about them. Hope feeds these fears by whispering that leaving now might be premature, that you haven't given them enough chances, that you'll wonder what if for the rest of your life. Hope becomes the voice that tells you to stay, even when your body is exhausted, your heart is heavy, and your intuition is screaming this kind of hope feels noble. It feels loyal. It feels like love, but beneath the surface, it's survival. It's the mind clinging to the smallest signs of stability in an unstable environment. It's trying to create emotional order out of chaos. It's trying to find meaning in behavior that doesn't make sense. It's trying to turn pain into purpose, because accepting the truth feels too overwhelming, so you stay. You endure. You wait. You negotiate with yourself. You tell yourself you're strong for holding on, when in reality you're stuck in a psychological maze designed to keep you believing that better days are just one more sacrifice away. And that belief, the relentless, aching, desperate hope, is what makes leaving feel not just difficult, but emotionally impossible. At times, leaving feels like losing yourself, not just the person. Because when you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, your identity becomes intertwined with their approval, their moods, and their version of who you're supposed to be. Over time, you stop being your own reference point. You start measuring yourself through their reactions, their validation, and their shifting standards. So when you think about leaving, it's not just walking away from them, it's walking away from the sense of self you were forced to build around them. It begins subtly. Small compromises, little sacrifices, adjustments in how you speak, what you express, what you allow yourself to feel. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens through a slow erosion of boundaries, a gradual conditioning where you learn that parts of you are unacceptable, inconvenient, or too much for them to handle. So you tuck those parts away. You reshape yourself to fit their expectations, because peace becomes more important than authenticity. And the more you shrink yourself, the more you begin to forget who you were before they entered your life. They become the center of everything: your choices, your emotions, your hopes, your fears. They position themselves as the judge of your worth. And eventually you start to believe that their version of you is the only version that matters. So when the thought of leaving comes, it doesn't feel like reclaiming yourself, because you don't even remember what that self looks like anymore. There's also the emotional attachment, not the healthy kind, but the traumatic bond created through cycles of affection and abuse. You get used to the highs and lows, the intensity, the urgency, the feeling that their approval is the reward for surviving their criticism. This bond convinces you that the relationship is special, deep, complicated in a way others couldn't understand. So leaving feels like abandoning something that feels powerful, even though that power comes from instability. Then there's the guilt, because narcissists are masters at making you responsible for everything. Their moods, their reactions, their past wounds, their insecurities. You carry burdens that were never yours. You try to prevent conflict, soothe their anger, protect their ego. And the longer you stay, the more you confuse caretaking with love. When you think about leaving, the guilt rises like a wall, whispering that you're selfish, ungrateful, or abandoning someone who needs you. Even though deep down, you know they don't truly need you, they need control. The confusion is another reason leaving feels like losing yourself. Narcissists rewrite history, they distort conversation, they deny what happened, flip blame, twist facts, and turn your feelings against you. Over time, you begin to doubt your own memory, your intuition, and your judgment. You question whether you're overreacting, whether you're the problem, whether you're imagining the patterns. So the idea of leaving becomes tangled with uncertainty. You don't just fear losing them, you fear not trusting yourself enough to leave. You also lose your emotional independence without even noticing. You start relying on them for permission to feel good about yourself. Their praise feels like sunlight after a long winter, and their disapproval feels like a storm you caused. When someone has this much influence over your emotional landscape, detaching from them feels like stepping into darkness. You're used to them defining your worth, even if their definition constantly changes. Without them, who are you? The question becomes terrifying, because you've been trained to believe that you're not enough on your own. Another layer is the isolation. Narcissists push away your support system, sometimes aggressively, sometimes subtly. They make you feel like your friends misunderstand you, your family doesn't care, or other relationships are distractions. They create dependency by cutting off your access to outside perspectives. And when you're isolated, leaving feels like stepping into a world where you have no one but yourself. The thought of rebuilding connections you lost feels overwhelming, so you convince yourself that staying is easier. Your self-worth becomes tangled with the idea of fixing the relationship. You've invested so much emotionally, mentally, spiritually that leaving feels like failure. You tell yourself that if you walk away now, it means all the effort was wasted. And because narcissists rarely take responsibility, you're left believing that if you just try harder, love louder, give more, or hold on longer, things will finally get better. Leaving feels like giving up on a story you've rewritten in your head 1,000 times, and then there's the fear of emptiness. Narcissistic relationships are emotionally consuming. They fill your days with chaos, intensity, conflict, and longing. As painful as that is, it's still something. The thought of leaving can feel like entering a void, quiet, uncertain, unfamiliar. You fear the silence. You fear the absence of the emotional roller coaster because you've become addicted to the adrenaline of the highs and lows. You think stillness will feel like loneliness, even though chaos has been hurting you all along. You also fear that you won't recognize your own needs outside the relationship. You've spent so long trying to meet theirs that you forgot your own voice. You forgot what makes you happy, what brings you peace, what you deserve. They've taken up so much space in your mind that imagining a life without them feels like erasing a chapter you lived inside for too long. Leaving feels like stepping into a new story where you don't know the plot, the rules, or the ending. There's also the fear of their reaction. Narcissists don't let people leave quietly. They punish, guilt trip, manipulate, threaten, charm, or confuse you back into their control. The anticipation of their response creates anxiety that makes leaving feel dangerous emotionally or psychologically. You begin to believe that staying is safer than confronting the storm that comes with walking away. You tell yourself that enduring the pain, is easier than facing the pain you don't. But the deepest reason leaving feels like losing yourself is because you've been conditioned to believe that your identity is tied to your suffering, that your love is proven by your endurance, that your value comes from your sacrifice. The narcissist didn't just take space in your life, they took space in your mind. They taught you that your needs don't matter, that your voice is too loud, too emotional, too sensitive. They made you shrink to fit their comfort. So when you think about leaving, it feels like losing a part of you because they convinced you that part was them, so you linger, you hesitate, you go back and forth. Not because you don't understand the situation, but because the situation has shaped your sense of self. Leaving feels like tearing away the version of you that was built around their acceptance. And that kind of emotional separation feels like losing a piece of your identity. Healing starts the moment you stop negotiating your value, because for so long in a relationship with a narcissist, your worth becomes a currency they manipulate. You learn to trade pieces of yourself for moments of peace. You give up your boundaries in exchange for temporary affection. You silence your own needs just to avoid conflict. You learn to bend, soften, shrink, and compromise, not because it's healthy, but because you've been conditioned to believe that love must be earned through sacrifice. And when you live like this long enough, you start negotiating your value without even noticing. You negotiate your time by giving more than you receive. You negotiate your emotions by pretending you're okay when you're hurting. You negotiate your boundaries by allowing treatment you swore you'd never tolerate. You negotiate your identity by reshaping yourself into whatever version of you keeps them calm. And every time you do, you lose a little more of the person you used to be. You become someone who measures their worth through someone else's approval. And that mindset makes healing feel out of reach, but healing begins at the exact moment you realize that your value is not up for debate. It doesn't depend on their mood. It doesn't fluctuate based on how they treat you. It doesn't disappear because they refuse to see it. The moment you stop trying to convince a narcissist that you matter, something shifts inside you. You stop trying to win a battle you were never meant to fight. You stop auditioning for a love that requires you to abandon yourself. You stop seeking validation from someone incapable of giving it consistently. Healing begins the moment you decide that your emotions are not inconveniences to be managed, but signals to be honored. For so long, you were told or shown that your feelings were too dramatic, too sensitive, too irrational. You learn to distrust your own reactions because they minimized everything that hurt you. So when you finally stop negotiating your right to feel what you feel, you reclaim something powerful. You reclaim your emotional truth. You allow yourself to acknowledge the pain that you've ignored, dismissed, or explained away. There is a moment in healing where something inside you says, quietly but firmly, I don't deserve this. It's not anger. It's not revenge. It's clarity. And that clarity is the beginning of rebuilding your value from the inside out. It's the first step towards seeing yourself as someone who doesn't have to earn basic respect, someone who doesn't have to justify why they deserve kindness, someone who doesn't need to twist themselves into shapes just to be accepted. Healing also starts when you stop negotiating the narrative. Narcissists rewrite stories in ways that make you question your reality. They tell you the argument never happened. They tell you your tone was the problem. They make you believe their behavior was your fault. They shift blame so often that you start apologizing for things you didn't do. And slowly, you learn to accept their version of events just to keep the peace. But there comes a point where you stop trying to make their perspective make sense. You stop trying to convince them that your experience is real. You stop seeking fairness from someone who thrives on distortion. That moment is the beginning of mental freedom. You no longer require their agreement to trust your own memory, your perception, or your intuition. You stop negotiating the truth, and in that space, healing begins. Another part of healing is recognizing that walking away from people who diminish your worth is not cruelty, it's self-preservation. Narcissists often convince you that leaving them is abandonment, betrayal, or heartlessness. They use guilt as a leash. But healing begins when you stop negotiating whether you're allowed to protect yourself. When you stop asking permission to prioritize your mental and emotional health. When you acknowledge that someone who harms you repeatedly does not get to define what loyalty looks like. You also stop negotiating your potential. Narcissists often make you believe that your dreams are unrealistic, your goals are childish, or your passions are distractions. They minimize anything that doesn't benefit them, and eventually, you stop dreaming as big as you used to. Healing begins when you reclaim those parts of yourself, the parts that wanted more, hoped for more, believed in more. When you start seeing your future as something worth fighting for, rather than something you're supposed to shrink to accommodate someone else. Healing also begins when you stop negotiating for scraps of affection. You stop being grateful for the bare minimum. You stop mistaking temporary kindness for growth. You stop excusing bad behavior because the good moments feel so rare and precious. You begin to see that real love doesn't come in fragments. Real love doesn't require you to endure pain just to earn small glimpses of happiness. When you stop settling for emotional leftovers, you create space for something healthier to enter your life. There is a moment when healing becomes less about leaving the narcissist and more about returning to yourself. It happens quietly. It happens without fireworks or dramatic announcements. It happens when you start making choices that honor your worth instead of negotiating it. When you say no without apologizing. When you stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. When you recognize that peace isn't earned, it's chosen, you begin to reconnect with parts of yourself you forgot existed. Your voice grows stronger. Your boundaries become clear. Your intuition becomes louder. You start noticing that you feel calmer without their chaos, more like yourself, without their criticism, more hopeful, without their manipulation. This is the part of healing that feels like breathing after holding your breath for too long. And most importantly, healing begins when you stop negotiating the belief that you are enough, because being with a narcissist teaches you that your value is conditional based on how useful you are, how forgiving you are, how quiet you are, how endlessly accommodating you can be. But the truth is, your worth has never been conditional. It has never depended on someone else's recognition. It has never been something you had to bargain for. When you stop negotiating your value, you stop giving people discounts on access to you. You stop allowing those who harm you to define you. You stop letting someone else's brokenness dictate your self-esteem. And in that moment, something inside you realize, you begin to see yourself clearly again. You begin to rebuild trust with yourself. You begin to heal.